Now, let's analyze some of the data on the 2021 general elections and what the numbers mean for the future of all parties that participated. Joining me to look at these numbers are Intel key founders, Keiran and Queswell Ferguson. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. It's always a pleasure to have you, and great job of doing this election cycle and period and the run-up to it with all of the stats that you were giving and the polling you were doing. Good job with that. I want to begin, first of all, I want to talk about some trends you saw during the elections, and also what is the margin of victory, what it has to say about people and how they feel about the FNM at this point. What can the FNM do to try and win back support? Will Minish remain the leader? Those are the kind of things we obviously will talk about. But I want you to begin talking to me about your slides and what it showed coming out of the election. Go ahead.
Good night, Clinton. It's great to be here. So firstly, we could go right into our polling, right? So we got some things right and we got some things wrong. Luckily, we got more things right than wrong. So it's definitely a good indicator of the future success and how pollings can be incorporated into how we look at general elections. So what did we get right? The FNM support was in the margin of error. So we had the FNM at 40% at the end of our poll. We had the Coalition of Independents at 6%. They got 6.75% of the total vote. We had the DNA at 2%. They were able to amass 1.4% of the total vote. Where things got a little tricky is, even at the end of our poll, we had 12% of voters undecided. So what we did is, on top of what we do in terms of web-based methodology, we also called all of those undecided voters and we said, have you made a decision on who you're going to vote for? And up until 7:30 p.m. the day before, 90% of the people that we called, and we called about 140 of the persons that selected undecided in our poll, and they were still undecided, right? So what we saw was general voter apathy, disengagement, and that sort of led to the overwhelming majority of those undecided voters siding with the PLP, and the FNM just not being able to do enough to rally their base and motivate undecided voters to make a selection to allow them to continue as the government of the Bahamas. So we can segue right into the actual results. So Keiran and I will go through this. So the first thing, and a huge part of it, right? So we did anticipate lower voter turnout, but at no point did we imagine that voter turnout would be as low as 65%. So during the 2021 general election, there were 195,000 roughly voters registered to vote. Only 127,000 of that 195 total registered voters participated at the polls, representing a 65% voter participation, the lowest in the history of the country. We also see the margin of victory for the PLP from a seat perspective, being 32 for the PLP, 7 for the FNM. Another thing that we noticed in our polls, and something that we had alluded to, was the fact that we saw a double-digit third-party support, something that was reminiscent or something that we saw during the 2012 general election. And when we start to group all of the third-party and independent support, that represented 11.28% of the total votes cast in the 2021 general election. And then when we look at it just from the positive and negative for the Free National Movement versus the PLP was able to increase their voter count by 11,000 votes, roughly. The FNM lost 45,000 plus votes.
45,000?
45,000. And just to add additional context to that voter turnout, right, that landed at 65%. Let's bear in mind that in the last cycle, it was actually at 88%. So what we see, is a massive drop-off. So when we talk about engagement, galvanizing voters to come out and support the party and party leaders, so to speak, we saw a significant drop-off there, resulting in the lowest turnout in history. So there's definitely something to pay attention to. There's definitely a lot of work to be done, as you alluded to, in terms of gaining the trust back of the Bahamian people and giving them a reason to show up and actually cast their votes. But it was very startling, definitely beyond what we projected. We did expect a decline of about 2 to 5%, but this is, frankly, way beyond that.
Wow, that's interesting. And you talked about obviously the voter turnout being low. And obviously, do you have any kind of idea as to why people didn't go to the polls?
So Clint, that's a great question. I mean, currently we have a poll called our post-election poll that's currently running. And the purpose of that is really to get a true understanding of what were the things or factors that led to people not going out to the polls, right? So we can make our assumptions, but again, the basis of our company is to have smarter conversations and jumpstart constructive conversations and really take into consideration the feeling of all Bahamians, right? But another thing that is interesting when we start to look at that low voter participation at 65%. So the PLP roughly got 52% of 65% of the total registered voters, right? So what that then means is that only 34% of registered voters in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas selected the PLP as their governing party. So when you start to talk about all of the comments that you're seeing in the Lion's Den, right? So the governing party doesn't enjoy the majority of Bahamian support of voters. So from day one, all of the decisions that they make will be heavily scrutinized, right? So again, unification is going to be very important, and we see the Prime Minister is definitely driving that message home.
And then just to also add a supporting point, in terms of the secondary research we did in voter registration, we saw the introduction of the permanent registry, right? And to an extent, that could have possibly inflated the amount of people. Usually we look at the amount of registered voters as kind of like a benchmark that is a predictor of how many people are going to show up to vote, right? But in this instance, you have people that are quote unquote registered or rolled over from cycle to cycle that may have not had any intention of voting in the first place. So that number is inflated. When we look at election cycle over election cycle, that increase was at about 7% overall. New Providence was plus 8%, Grand Bahama 5%, Family Islands 4%. So that plays a factor into it as well.
What about parties like DNA and Coalition? Coalition, its first time out, they got a significant amount of votes. DNA, however, performed worse than they did in the previous election.
Yeah, so that's a good question. And when we start to look at the third party and independent support, so overall, third party and independent candidates were able to get 11.28% of the total share of the vote. The Coalition of Independents represented 6.75% of that total third party and independent support. And one of the things that we saw stand out, for example, Frederick McAlpine in Grand Bahama, who had 1,200 plus votes. We also saw that Mr. Lincoln Bain and Mr. K. Mills in North Abaco and Pinewood, respectively, also were able to get over 500 total votes. But here's where it's interesting, right? Because at the end of the day, we're first past the post, whichever party is able to get the most seats. So we have 5 seats where the differential between the PLP and F&M is actually less than the amount of total votes that a third party or independent was able to get in that constituency. So the 5 constituencies are Carmichael, Elizabeth, Mount Moriah, North Abaco, and Central and South Abaco. So in those 5 particular instances, when we look at the numbers, we see that very clearly the difference between F&M and PLP support was actually less than the total amount of votes that third-party candidates like the Coalition of Independents, DNA, and other
Which means they made a
candidates.
difference in those constituencies
Definitely.
the outcome.
Definitely, especially when we look at Mr. K. Mills, Kai Mills, who got 700 total votes, right? So he had a significant impact on the result in that particular constituency.
Wow.
And then, just delving into the DNA, right, and the decrease in support that we've seen cycle over cycle. So in 2012, they were at 8.5%. In 2017, that dropped to 4.7%. And now we see most recently 1%, just under 2%. We had projected 2%. They actually came in at 1.4%. So we see a decrease there as well.
That's an alarming trend to go from 8.5% in your first time to 4.7% your second run. That's half. And then in your third run to go to 1.4%. It seems as if they were progressively becoming worse rather than improving.
That's correct. And the interesting thing about that is the 2017 slate of candidates was much larger than what they had in 2021.
Right.
But that also speaks possibly to their inability to recruit candidates to run for the party, right? So there's 2 layers. So number one, you have the inability to recruit quality candidates. And then secondly, you're losing confidence amongst the general electorate.
Wow, some interesting factors there, some interesting points there, obviously to be considered. All right, let's take a break and be right back. We'll wrap up. Welcome back. I'm wrapping up with Intel Key founders Keiran, Chase, and Queswell Ferguson, giving analysis to the election. And obviously, the next thing to look at is obviously the margin won by persons. So let's talk a little bit about those margins from those who won. Who are the larger margins?
Definitely, Clint. And what we'd also encourage everyone to do is that we have this particular dashboard that we're sharing today available now, so you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram to keep up with and get a look at all of this information, right? So when we start to look at larger share of vote by candidates, we see that the deputy leader and the leader of the Progressive Liberal Party definitely did what they needed to do. We see that Mr. Chester Cooper enjoyed a 73% share of vote in Exuma and the Ragged Islands. The Right Honorable Philip Brave Davis enjoying 70% of the share of vote in Cat Island, Rumkey, and San Salvador. And the candidate with the largest share of vote was the Honorable Glennis Hannah Martin in Engliston at 75% of the vote, right? And we saw a story float around today where the F&M candidate almost didn't get sufficient votes to get his deposit back, right? Wow. Which would have been something that is unprecedented for a candidate of the major parties. And one of the things that you had alluded to, Clint, is sort of that leadership vacuum in the Free National Movement in the event that Dr. Minnis decides to step down. And what we saw is that one of the persons that is the head of that room is Mr. Honorable Michael Pintard, who was able to get 57% of the share of the vote in Marco City, with a margin over the Progressive Liberal Party of 24%. Additionally, we see in St. Anne's the MP-elect Adrian White, who was able to also get 57% of the vote, but his lead over the Progressive Liberal Party wasn't as wide as Mr. Pintard's.
All right, so obviously some big margins there from persons, and it'll be interesting to see how it goes forward and what happens with the electorate going forward. Interesting, we have new government, we have new cabinet ministers. More will be sworn in reportedly tomorrow. And then they'll get off to work on the ground. Gentlemen, it's always a pleasure having you to come and share these important stats. And of course, be sure to check out Intel Key tell them your platform so people can see, because now the election's over, you still continue. You're going to be doing in surveys and polls on a whole lot of different things that people ought to be involved in. So tell them where they can find you.
Yes, Intel Key on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and intelkey.com.
All right, thank you so much, gentlemen, for being here. Your inspirational word is up next. Stay close.